How's it going, everyone? My name is Swanee and welcome to my channel. Now on April 29th, Helldivers 2 had its biggest update ever, with tons of bug fixes, balancing changes, and a lot of controversy in the community due to said changes. Now the patch notes are insanely long and there's a ton of changes, and this video is already going to be about a half an hour long anyway, so in this video I'm just going to cover the primary weapon changes, and then in another video I will go over all of the secondary weapon changes and the stratagem changes. And since this video is going to be pretty long, as always, the timestamps can be found down below and in the description. I'll even have them down in the pinned comment. That way, if there's one weapon in particular that you want to skip ahead to, you can do so. And before we get started, I just want to say that I did all of my testing for each of these weapons on level 7 difficulty due to one of the new changes they just added in this recent update. They made a new controversial change to enemy patrols. It says patrol spawning has been increased when there are fewer than 4 players. The fewer the players, the bigger the change. For 4-player missions, there will be no change compared to before. The biggest noticeable change will be for solo players at higher difficulties. And they weren't kidding, because I tried to originally do this on Helldive, and it was close to impossible. It is still possible to solo on Helldive difficulty, but there are just so many more patrols now in the environment, and just tons and tons of enemies on Helldive difficulty, that it made for the testing to be a little bit inconsistent. I wasn't able to actually take my time and get a good feel for each of these weapons because I was constantly getting attacked. So I found that level 7 was the best for my testing. It still gave me a wide variety of enemies to fight, and it was still pretty challenging, but I did all of my testing playing solo, and this new patrol change was definitely noticeable. When playing solo, I found that I was getting ambushed from behind way more often than before this update. There are just so many patrols that are constantly spawning that you are never safe just standing in one spot. If you decide to stand your ground and try to just fight off all the enemies, you aren't going to go anywhere. They're just going to keep spawning and sending more and more waves, so you always have to be on the move when you're playing solo, or you're just never going to beat the mission. Alright, so with that said, let's jump right into the changes. So the first weapon on this list is the CB9 Exploding Crossbow. The changes made were they gave it a slightly smaller explosion, they gave it increased stagger, they decreased the number of magazines from 12 to 8, they increased the number of magazines received from resupply from 6 to 8, so when you get a resupply now you basically get full ammo. There's a slight reduction to the ergonomics. This means that the weapon sway is a little bit slower, and then the muzzle velocity has been increased. So overall, you can definitely feel the nerf on this weapon. This was already a weapon that I felt like it needed a buff, and I never saw anyone use it when I did quick play matches, but now it feels like I'm just constantly running out of ammo. You only get 5 shots before you have to reload, and sometimes, depending on the enemy type, if it's like a medium tier enemy, it's going to take you every bit of those 5 shots or more to take out a medium armored enemy like a Devastator. I will say though that the stagger is nice. It was pretty handy to be able to constantly stagger the Devastators and stuff, but the damage is just so little that it takes too many shots to kill these enemies. And the crossbow feels pretty much useless when it comes to bigger enemies like chargers or hulks or tanks or anything like that. Before this update, the crossbow was good at taking out small groups of enemies. Anytime there was a bunch of small bugs clustered up together, or if some robots just got dropped out of a dropship, you could shoot this at their feet and the explosion damage would take out multiple enemies at the same time. But now with the smaller explosion radius, it's definitely a lot harder to take out those small groups. I will say though that when you pick up a resupply and it basically fills up all of your ammo, that is pretty nice, but you know, switching from 12 magazines down to 8, it's basically a trade-off, and now I found myself constantly calling in resupplies. Another thing I noticed with the crossbow is that before it was good against the scout striders, and now it just isn't nearly as good at taking them out, because on average it'll probably take 3 to 4 shots to kill them, when before it would take 1 to 2 shots. This has to do with both the crossbow having a smaller explosion radius, and they made a change to the scout striders so that the riders now are less vulnerable to explosions. So the combination of those two things just makes the scout striders a lot harder to kill, and it just overall makes the weapon feel a lot weaker than what it used to be. I will say though that the range has been drastically increased with the faster velocity it got, so it can shoot farther and the bolts reach the target a lot faster. If you look at the before and after, before the update it had a crazy drop off at about 30 to 40 meters, and you had to aim up in the air and kind kind of arch your shots. Now, after this update, you can very easily and accurately hit enemies that are over 80 meters without a problem. So the range increase and the faster velocity of your bolts is definitely noticeable, and that is a great change. However, overall, this weapon does feel a bit weaker to me. I don't really understand why they decided to nerf it this hard when it just wasn't that good to begin with, and until this weapon receives some sort of damage buff, I just don't see myself using this anytime soon. So the next weapon on this list is the BR-14 Adjudicator. Now this weapon only got buffs, it didn't get any nerfs at all, which is great. Full auto is now the default firing mode. It has reduced recoil, increased maximum mags from 6 to 8, so now it can hold even more ammunition. They increased the number of magazines received from resupply from 6 to 8, so now when you pick up a resupply, you basically get full ammo, and now this weapon is placed among the assault rifles. Now before this update, this weapon did struggle. I would say it was probably one of the least favorite weapons among the community in the latest war bond that we received. I mean, it was going up against both the Crossbow and the Eruptor, and the Eruptor was amazing, so it had pretty steep competition, and it just didn't feel like it was in a good spot. It was labeled as a marksman rifle, and it just wasn't nearly as good as the Diligence counter sniper, so there wasn't really a reason to choose it. But now that it's marked as an assault rifle, it technically has the highest base damage out of all the assault rifles, and it has medium armor penetrating. And after testing it in a number of different matches against both the Terminids and the Automatons, I would say overall it just feels a lot better. The one gripe I have with it is that it only holds 25 rounds in a magazine, and I feel like if it would hold 30, it would be in the perfect spot, because I found that it does pretty good damage, especially to those medium tier enemies that are armored, but I often found myself constantly reloading and running out of ammo because it only holds 25 rounds. But being able to switch from fully automatic to single shot is pretty handy. It feels like you get two weapons in one now. You get both an assault rifle and a marksman rifle. It still unfortunately has an issue with the scope. The bullets aren't exactly lined up with the scope for some reason, which can make your shots a little bit inaccurate. I was struggling a bit when it came to ranged attacks with this weapon, just due to how inaccurate the scope can be sometimes. But honestly, I think the weapon is in a pretty good state now. Overall, it just got buffed, and you can definitely tell a big difference. I would say that this weapon is worth using now, and if I want to use an assault rifle, this is one of the choices that I would add to my arsenal. Before this update, this is one of the weapons that I just sat on the shelf and I would never touch it, and now it's actually a pretty viable option. This update definitely buffed the BR-14 Adjudicator for the good, and it's got my seal of approval. Alright, so next up on the list is one of my favorites of this update, and it's the SG-8 Punisher Plasma. Now, it did see a bit of a nerf to the magazine size. They decreased the maximum mags from 12 to 8, which you can definitely notice with this weapon. They increased the amount of magazines received from resupply from 6 to 8, so yet again, if you get a resupply, it will basically take you to close to full ammo. And then they said they increased the projectile speed, but will still keep a similar range. They decreased the damage fall off on the explosion, and it is now placed in the energy weapons category. So the Punisher Plasma was already a pretty good option when it came to facing the automatons. This thing has crazy stagger, so it is really good at stopping the rocket devastators dead in their tracks. Right as they're about to charge up their rockets, you could just stun lock them in place. Same kind of goes for the heavy devastators. Those guys are always a big pain in the butt, and they just keep spraying you down and they never reload. Well, the Punisher Plasma is probably the best weapon in the game when it comes to staggering these medium tier automatons. And with the increased projectile speed that they just added, this weapon is crazy good when it comes to staggering enemies now. When playing against the Terminids, it's just okay. It's really good at killing the small groups of bugs and stuff. It's really good at taking out groups of hunters that are chasing you, or stun locking some of the brood commanders, or if a stalker's getting up in your face, the Punisher Plasma is good at stopping it right in its tracks. But the Punisher Plasma does struggle at the bigger enemies, like it doesn't do anything to the Bile Titans, obviously, and I found it was really struggling against the Chargers as well, so I would make sure you bring some sort of stratagem with you to help deal with the Chargers and stuff. But from my testing, I found that it was just kind of average when it came to facing the Terminids. But then when it comes to facing the automatons, I think this is one of the best automaton weapons. I will say though that this weapon is probably best used if you're in a squad because of all the staggering it does. If you're taking on a medium tier enemy like a Devastator, you are going to be going through a lot of your ammo because it's going to take you a lot of shots to take out a Devastator just by itself. For example, if you're trying to kill a rocket Devastator, it might take you your entire magazine to kill just one Devastator. So the main benefit of this weapon isn't its overall damage, it's that stagger that it pulls off. It's also a really great alternative to taking out the Scout Striders now that they take a lot less explosive damage. That kind of limits your options to taking out these Scout Striders very easily, and I found that the Punisher Plasma can still do it in just 1 to 2 hits. The increased projectile speed on the Punisher Plasma really buffed the crap out of this weapon, and I had a ton of fun using it. I really enjoyed the stagger effect that this Punisher Plasma has to offer. I would say after this buff, the Punisher Plasma is now probably one of the very best crowd control weapons in the entire game. So the next big weapon buff on the list was to the Arc 12 Blitzer shotgun. Well, except now it's no longer a shotgun, it's been placed in the energy weapon category. But the buff that it received is that it increased the number of shots per minute from 30 to 45. So those 15 extra shots that you can get off in a minute make a big difference. Now, I tested the new and improved Arc 12 Blitzer against both the automatons and the terminids. Now, I'll talk about the automatons first, since this weapon was never really designed to face the automatons, and it does an okay job now against the automatons. The problem is that you don't really want to get up close and personal with the automatons. They will kind of wreck your face because they all have ranged attacks, and you kind of want to keep your distance with the automatons, and this thing definitely has a lack of range. You really have to get right up in the enemy's face if you're going to use the Arc 12 Blitzer, but I will say that the high rate of fire does make a big difference. You can stun lock some of those bigger enemy types. Those enemies that have the chainsaw hands, it does a good job of taking them out. It obviously takes out the smaller enemies in just 1 shot, and it does a good job of stun locking the Devastators as well, but just overall, I don't really recommend this weapon against the automatons. It's not bad per se, it's just you're going to find yourself having a really hard time getting up close and in the face of all these automatons. But now let's talk about the terminids, which is where this weapon really shines. And boy oh boy is this weapon amazing against the terminids. Now, I did struggle when I played on level 9 solo. It was a bit rough with all the enemies they were throwing at me. But when I was playing on level 7 or when I played with my friends, it was doing an amazing job. If there is a large crowd of terminids chasing you, I'm talking hunters and the gatherers and the warriors and even the brood commanders, it will just wreck everything. I was getting insane kill streaks using literally nothing but this Arc 12 Blitzer. And the fact that the lightning can chain to multiple targets at the same time, you can take out 3 or 4 enemies with just 1 shot. It feels really good. Now, I will say this weapon is kind of gimmicky. It does put you up close and in the face of all the enemies, so if something goes wrong, it's going to go wrong very quickly. For example, if something stun locks you, or if you get hit by a charger or something, odds are you're already in front of a large group of enemies anyway, so if you get stun locked or knocked over, you're just going to get swarmed and they're going to wreck your face. But regardless of that, I was still having a lot of fun with this weapon and I was really enjoying it. I will say though that this weapon absolutely blows when it comes to fighting chargers though, so avoid that at all costs. It's just not going to happen. It doesn't matter how many times you shoot it. By itself, the Arc 12 Blitzer just won't kill chargers or Bile Titans, so you have to bring some sort of secondary support weapon or stratagems to take out those guys. But when it comes to any terminid below a charger, it will just wreck through all of them. And I think this makes for a really fun play style, and I was really enjoying my time testing out this weapon. So this one definitely has my seal of approval as well, and I was having a ton of fun testing out this weapon, and I think you guys are going to have a lot of fun too if you give this one a shot. If you were a fan of the Arc 12 Blitzer before, you're going to love it even more now, and if you were never really a fan of the Arc 12 Blitzer, I say give it another chance now because it is a lot better, and trust me, I think you're going to have a lot of fun. So next up is one of my favorite weapons in all of Helldivers 2, it's the R36 Eruptor. So they only made 2 changes to it technically in the patch notes. They decreased the number of magazines from 12 to 6, and the explosive damage now drops off slightly faster. Now I will say this weapon definitely deserved a nerf to the ammo count. Having 12 magazines before this update made it so I never ran out of ammo. I don't think I ever once burned through all 12 of my magazines before this update. I would always either get another resupply or find an ammo crate on the ground before I was in trouble of running out of bullets. So it definitely needed some sort of nerf to the magazines. It's definitely noticeable now having only 6 magazines, so you do have to kind of play on the safe side with managing your ammo. But overall, it's not the end of the world. I don't think this is a change that's going to negatively affect the weapon all that much. And then for the explosive damage dropping off slightly faster, I tried testing around with this, but I couldn't really tell much of a difference. I was still able to hit enemies enemies at medium range and they were still blowing up just fine. If there's a small group of enemies, I could just shoot them and it would blow them all up at once. So I wasn't really noticing too much of a damage drop off when I was using this weapon, and it honestly kind of felt the same. The one thing I did, however, notice was the stealth nerf that this weapon received when they buffed the explosive resistance to the Scout Striders. Since the Scout Striders now take reduced explosive damage, the Eruptor can no longer one-shot kill Scout Striders when shooting them in the front. It will now take you upwards of 2 to 3 shots to take out these Scout Striders depending on your angle. So that is kind of a stealth nerf that was applied to the Eruptor. Not being able to take out the Scout Striders in one shot makes this weapon feel a lot weaker than what it did before. So if you're a fan of the Eruptor, that's probably one of the biggest changes that you're going to notice with it. Now currently there is this big controversy going on in the community because they made changes to how bullets ricochet off of heavy armor and stuff, and apparently there's this big issue in the community where people are using the Eruptor and it's deflecting bullets back into your face and it can one-shot kill you. Now I'm sure this does happen to people, and in my testing I couldn't get this to happen to me at all. I never once killed myself using the Eruptor, but as of yesterday, Spitz, one of the community managers, actually posted this over on the Discord talking about how they're going to make changes, and they listened to the community feedback about the ricocheting, and they're going to change the way that shrapnel works. They said, however, we noticed another issue through these posts and community feedback that identified the possibility of shots for the Eruptor to explode and rebound shrapnel at the shooter, which had a high enough damage value to instantly kill the player. To prevent this, we're looking to completely remove the shrapnel effect from the Eruptor, but we'll be increasing its hit damage as a result. This should make it less lethal to the user, but just as powerful against enemies. Then they continued to say it should maintain its destructive power as it's still classed as explosive. It will not lose the ability to break objects, close holes, destroy fabricators, etc. This will overall be a buff to the weapon, as the random shrapnel played an almost negligible part to the damage in its power it dealt. It will still deal both impact and AoE damage. Both of these damage values will be increased to make it just as powerful and more consistent. So as of recording this video, it's currently bugged and it will sometimes blow up in your face, but they're apparently going to have a hotfix very soon to fix this issue, and as stated in that post, they're going to make it even stronger and buff it even more, which is just absolutely crazy. So as it stands right now, I feel like the Eruptor is still a pretty good weapon. It wasn't affected too negatively from these nerfs, and I still think that the Eruptor is one of the best weapons in all of Helldivers 2 currently, and it's obviously still worth using. So the next change on this list is the LAS-16 Sickle, and they decreased the amount of magazines from 6 down to 3. Now the LAS-16 Sickle feels just like an auto rifle, and it plays like an auto rifle, and it's extremely accurate and does a great job of just melting through enemies. But when it comes to ammo management, if you're really smart and you play it safely, you can essentially have unlimited ammo when you use this weapon. As long as you don't let this weapon overheat, you will have unlimited ammo, and because of that, people were never running out of ammo. I think the most I've ever had to reload this weapon is twice, and that's when I was playing a little on the aggressive side, and even then you can still find ammo boxes lying around the map, or you can call in a resupply. So ammo has never really been a problem with this weapon, so they decreased it from 6 down to 3, and in my playtesting I didn't even notice this change because I never find myself reloading this weapon. As long as you pay attention to this weapon and you don't let it overheat, you'll be absolutely fine and you won't notice this nerf either. So on paper, the LAS-16 Sickle got a nerf, but it's not really that noticeable. And then up next, the LAS-5 Scythe also got some changes. They increased the damage from 300 to 350, and they decreased the magazines from 6 to 4. Now the Scythe works the same way as the Sickle, where if you pay attention and you don't let this weapon overheat, you can pretty much have unlimited ammo. So you're not going to notice the nerf to the magazine size as long as you don't let this weapon overheat. Now, as for the damage increase from 300 to 350, I'd say overall it feels better against the Terminids and the Automatons, but it isn't amazing. It feels like it overheats way too early, and it takes close to an entire heat sink to kill medium tier enemies. So I recommend pairing this with a good secondary. I paired it with the Senators. That way, anytime this weapon was cooling down, I would just switch to the Senator and pop off a couple shots. It would do some crazy high damage, and then I would switch back to the Scythe. I mean, it does have its upsides. Having potential unlimited ammo is always a good thing, but I feel like for me to consider using this on the regular, I would either increase the amount of time that you can shoot before before it overheats, or I would give it even more of a damage buff. So to summarize it, I would say yes, it is technically better than it was before, but it still doesn't really feel that good to me. I played about 3 to 4 matches with it, and I mean, it was just doing okay. I wasn't blown away by it or anything. So that's kind of all I really have to say about the new Scythe changes. So the next weapon on this list is a big one, and it's the Diligence Counter Sniper. The damage has been increased from 128 to 140, and the ergonomics have been improved. This means that the weapon sway is a lot faster, so you can kind of snap between targets really quickly. And this has to be one of my favorite changes on this update, because this damage increase is crazy. I was having so much fun testing out this weapon, because if you can land a headshot on a medium tier enemy like a Devastator, it will one-shot kill Devastators now, which is amazing. The Devastators are one of the hardest enemy types to face against the automatons, and if you can easily take out the Devastators, then there's no problems. I was sitting off at a distance just picking off all the Devastators with ease. And when I was playing with my friends, I could just sit back at a distance, they could rush into the enemy base, and I could give them covering fire, just picking off enemies left and right. And when there's a large group of smaller enemies, like the robots or the little scavenger bugs, there is nothing more satisfying than just popping them over and over and over. There was multiple times where I faced a large group of robots, and I was just pop, 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 and it was just so much fun. I don't know how else to put it other than that the counter sniper actually feels like it should. It feels like it's in a really good spot right now. And this very quickly shot straight up to the top of my list when it comes to facing the automatons. And it still does a pretty decent job against the Terminids. Since it has medium armor penetrating, it does a pretty decent job of taking out anything that's less than a charger. You know, obviously it's going to struggle against chargers and the Bile Titans, but when it comes to the Bile Spewers, just a couple shots to the face and they will immediately die. So this is just an all-around great option to use no matter what your enemy type is. And this is one of my favorite buffs in the entire update. It definitely has my seal of approval. I love the Diligence Counter Sniper now. So next up is the regular R63 Diligence. Now, it also got a damage increase from 112 to 125, and I'd say it feels pretty good against the automatons. Against medium tier enemies like the Devastators, it can two-shot them in the head, which, you know, it's not as good as the counter sniper, but this one does hold more ammo. So that's kind of the trade-off. You can rapid fire shots off more quickly, but it does less damage than the counter sniper. I will say though, when I was trying it out against the Terminids, it was struggling a bit. I needed to pair it with something that could do armor penetration. Since the regular Diligence only has light armor penetration, I was having a really hard time trying to get past the armor that some of those bugs have. Anytime they like try to defend themselves and they put their arms up in front of their head to protect themselves, I was having a hard time dealing with those guys. And in my opinion, I definitely feel like this is better suited against the robots versus the bugs. And overall, this weapon does feel better, but it's just not as good as the counter sniper. I would much rather take the extra firepower and less ammo versus more ammo and less firepower. So the weapon did get a buff. It does feel better. It's just not my go-to choice. If you're a fan of the R63 Diligence before, then you're obviously going to like it better now. But when compared to some of the other weapons that got buffed on this list, I can't really recommend this one that much. Next up on the list is the Jar 5 Dominator, and it technically got a nerf on paper. It says that the damage was decreased from 300 to 275. Now, honestly, I tested this out and I can't tell a difference. It still does just as good as it always did. It is one of the best automaton weapons in the game, and don't get me wrong, it does pretty decent against the Terminids too. Since the Dominator has medium armor penetration, it pretty much shreds anything that has medium armor, and I figured I would notice some sort of a difference, but it can still just wreck Devastators. It still one-shot kills anything that's small. I think it feels pretty much exactly the same. I couldn't tell much of a difference at all, and I still think this is one of the top tier weapons for facing the automatons. Next up is the AR-23C Liberator Concussive. It got a damage increase from 55 to 65, and in my testing, I found that it did a lot better against the automatons, and it has insane stagger, so it was constantly stopping enemies mid-animation. I could tell that the extra damage was definitely noticeable. It doesn't do crazy damage though compared to some of the other weapons, especially some of the other like assault rifles, but it does give you 10 magazines, so the extra ammo kind of makes up for the lack of damage. This buff, I'd say, made it go from a weapon that I'd never use like ever to one that I'd consider using on occasion to face up against the automatons. Now against the Terminids, I think it blows ass. I think it is awful, like absolutely awful still. It just pushes all the enemies backwards, and I had a hard time killing anything. Most of the Terminids that I was shooting were just getting staggered, and it felt like I wasn't doing any damage to them. It felt like I was just tickling them. And it's not really helpful when you have a horde of like 40 Terminids coming at you, and all you can do is push them back, and you can't really hurt them that much. So I would say that the Liberator Concussive is usable now, but I would definitely use it if you're in a squad. I would avoid using it if you're a solo player, but if you're in a squad and you're playing with teammates, this is a really great support weapon. I would not go into a match expecting to use this weapon and to get a ton of kills. This is a great weapon to use to stagger the enemies, and then your teammate can maybe run up and shoot it in the face with a shotgun, or just help you take out an enemy's weak spot. I would say that 100% this weapon did get better, but it's still lacking something. But hey, that's just my opinion. Definitely try it out for yourselves and see if you like the Liberator Concussive. And now moving on to the final primary weapon that got changed. It's the default assault rifle, the very first weapon that you get in the game, the AR-23 Liberator, and it got a damage increase from 55 to 60. And I think this is my #1 favorite change in the entire update, because honestly, this weapon feels great now. It melts smaller enemies, and even does a really great job at taking out the medium tier enemies, even though it only has light armor penetration. This weapon definitely feels like it's punching up a lot harder than it should, and I don't quite understand why. It has basically no recoil, it's super accurate. When testing against both enemy types, I will say that it does a better job against the Terminids. It will just melt through anything less than a charger against the Terminids. It does a good job against the automatons as well. It just struggles against the bigger ones. It doesn't do the greatest job against the heavy devastators or the rocket devastators, just because it has that light armor penetrating, so a lot of my shots were pinging off of the armor, but it makes short work of any of these smaller robots. So this is just kind of like a great ad clearing weapon now for the automatons, but for the Terminids, I 100% recommend it for the Terminids. It is one of the best weapons there is against the Terminids. And I don't know why, but just that 5 damage increase suddenly made this weapon like S tier. Like, it is so good. I had my friends all try it out too. They all had great things to say about it. They absolutely love the AR-23 Liberator, and I just can't praise this weapon enough. And if you haven't tried it yet, I highly recommend it. I know a lot of people have been sleeping on this weapon because, you know, who thinks to go back and try the default assault rifle? Most people aren't going to think that the first weapon they give you is going to be one of the best weapons, but, well, now it kind of is. And like I said, this is probably one of my favorites, if not my just overall favorite change that they made in this latest update. So that is going to do it for all the changes that were made to the primary weapons. I was going to try to cover every single change in this video, but this video is already too long, so I'm probably going to make a part 2 where I go over all the new stratagem changes, like the Quasar Cannon, the heavy machine gun, the railgun changes, and then I'm going to talk about all the secondary weapon changes that were made in this patch as well. This video took me forever to make and a ton of editing, and I basically got like no sleep over the past couple days, so if you gave this video a thumbs up, that would be a huge help. And if you're new here, please consider hitting the subscribe button and hitting the bell for notifications, that way you don't miss out on any future Helldivers 2 videos. And that is going to do it for me, guys, and I will talk to you all next time.